Good evening, and welcome to Beyond Business at the Wharton School. My name is Dean Erica James, and I have the pleasure of spending this evening with you and colleagues to talk about ESG. Beyond Business is an ongoing conversation that explores the most complex and pressing issues impacting individuals and organizations around the world. This year's three-part series shines a light on how firms are striving to contribute positively to the environment, address government discrepancies, and support social causes. There are three different topics in our series this year. The first one, tonight's topic, is tackling the climate crisis, which explores the role that environmental criteria should play in business decision-making and what firms and policymakers can do to measure and deliver impact. Our next series is redefining corporate governance, which explores how boards can maximize a company's social impact while balancing the needs of its stakeholders, and how data can be employed to help measure success. And our third series is Humanizing ESG, explores the business case for firms using their influence to impact social and political issues and how they can evaluate its role in being a force for change. The Beyond Business series is made possible by former Mickey Tarnopol. The Tarnopol Lecture Series is named for the late Mickey Tarnopol, who's a 1958 graduate of the Wharton School, and his wife, Lynn. A global business leader, Mr. Tarnopol served as vice chairman of the International Banking Division of Bear Stearns & Company. He was an active member of the Penn and Wharton community, a longtime member of the Board of Overseers, and served as vice chair of Penn's Board of Trustees and founded the Penn Club of New York. I am thrilled to introduce my guests this evening. Sarah Light is an associate professor of legal studies and business ethics at Wharton. Her research examines issues at the intersection of environmental law, corporate sustainability, and business innovation. Benjamin Keyes is also a Wharton professor of real estate and finance, who studies issues related to household finance, mortgage finance, and real estate, including the inefficiencies of the government's National Flood Insurance Program and how real estate decisions are affected by environmental factors. David Swift is Chief Operating Officer of Engine No. 1, an investment firm whose purpose is to create long-term value through active ownership. He has over 15 years of experience partnering with asset managers to help them evolve through strategic business development initiatives. Before we begin our conversation, just a few housekeeping notes. Our conversation will start this evening with Sarah, Ben, and David, followed by your questions. Please use the chat function to submit your questions at any point throughout our time this evening. Let's get started. So, Sarah, there are dire reports by the United Nations and others that there is a severe rise in severe weather events worldwide, and that this rise in events have put climate change on everyone's radar screen. Whether we develop new governmental policies, work together to create new energy efficient technologies, or commit to reducing emissions through nature-based solutions, more and more people believe something needs to be done. But what is the role of business that business should play in this endeavor? So, Sarah, starting with you, how do you see companies responding to the calls to address climate change? And is this response adequate?
Thank you, Erica, so much for having all of us here this evening to discuss this incredibly important topic. Business firms are indeed responding to the call to address the climate crisis, and the responses have grown increasingly frequent and louder in the past months and weeks, particularly in the lead up to what is going to be the next Conference of the Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow, starting at the end of this month. Overall, firms are generally doing several things. I think that they should be doing three things. So the first thing that firms frequently are, but certainly ought to be doing, is looking to manage and measure their emission emissions from their on-site operations and their purchases of electricity. So how are we as a firm emitting greenhouse gases during our production processes, during on-site activities, and could we purchase renewable energy in order to power our operations? The second thing that many firms are doing is actually looking beyond their on-site operations to their value chain. And this is something that if firms are not already doing, they should be doing actively. So this includes everything from upstream supply chain emissions. So for example, Walmart has adopted Project Gigaton to attempt to reduce more than 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases from their global value chain. Firms in the asset management and lending spaces are seeking to reduce to net zero the greenhouse gas emissions from their lending portfolios or their asset management portfolios. And these are really important concrete steps. And many firms are taking these steps under the auspices of some kind of third-party certification organization like the Science Based Targets Initiative, which provides accountability and transparency. The third step, arguably the most controversial, is the one that not all firms have gotten there, and I would want to encourage them to do this, and that is to put their money where their mouth is when it comes to advocating for public policies that will support a transition to a net zero economy by 2050.
Thank you, Sarah. Clearly, you have spent quite a bit of time thinking about what firms should and ought to do. Ben, let's turn to you. Government has traditionally borne some of the risk related to severe weather events such as hurricanes and flooding. What kinds of policy shifts are you seeing as the frequency and cost of these events increase? And do you feel these changes are sufficient?
Yeah, well, first, thanks so much, Erica, for convening this talk and this series of talks on such an important topic. Just starting with the severity of weather events, and we're thinking about the amount that this has increased in the 1980s. There was an average of about $3 billion disasters per year. Again, CPI adjusted. This past year, 2020, we had 22 billion-dollar disasters in the US, and we've been averaging over $15 billion disasters per year. And so I think, there's a recognition in the housing space and the mortgage space that these growing risks are going to need to be addressed, and that the federal government is not going to simply pick up the tab in the ways that they have in the past. And so the National Flood Insurance Program has run a net deficit basically since its entire existence. It's never accurately priced risk correctly, either in terms of drawing the map boundaries at the sort of frontier of our knowledge, but also in terms of pricing these policies. And there are some trade-offs in terms of if you want to run this like a business or not, because we should worry about access and affordability for low-income households. But I think what we're seeing, especially recently with Risk Rating 2.0, so this was the change in pricing that brought some of those most subsidized properties up to a more reasonable standard in terms of price. I think we're seeing policymakers putting these programs at least on a path towards getting the pricing right. And I think that that's going to send strong signals to the market. And so that's going to influence buyers and thinking about where to buy their next home. It's going to influence lenders and in terms of whether they should commit on a 30-year mortgage for this property. And then ultimately it's going to influence developers and where should the next development be located. And we know that with these durable assets, these decisions that they make now are going to have lasting decisions for the next 10, 20, 50 years. And so it's really important to put a program like this on a path towards making people aware of the true risks that they face.
Thank you. Ben and David spend their day hours sort of engaging in the research to identify what are the best things that companies should be doing and what are the real solutions we need to be driving. But David, I want to bring in your input into this question, largely because you spend your life actually in the world, operating with companies and focusing on this issue from their perspective. So in his letter to CEOs in 2020, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink said that climate risk is investment risk. What are some of the changes you're seeing across the investment community in response to the financial impact of climate change?
Yeah, thank you, Erica. It's a great question, and we agree with Larry that these environmental issues are economic issues. That's really a founding principle for engine number one and why we started this organization. The investment community has responded in a number of different ways, but what we've seen the most is the launch of ESG strategies to respond to climate change and try to address some of these issues. Unfortunately, a lot of the ESG strategies that we've seen come to market use what's called a negative screening approach. And so what they're doing is screening out the companies that are quote unquote bad and screening in the companies that are on the right side of climate change, cleaner companies. But the problem with negative screening is that when you screen out a bad company, it doesn't really inspire that company to change their behavior. It doesn't drive the change that we want to see as climate change is becoming a more and more material issue and is a high degree of urgency with that issue. And so, at engine number one, we've kind of shifted that narrative and said, let's not move away from these businesses. Let's own these companies as active owners because we want to engage with the management team of these businesses and really point out the materiality of the environmental issues as economic issues and material to their business. We want them to understand them and understand the issue as a shareholder issue. What we don't want to happen is to not own these businesses and concentrate the shareholder base, the remaining shareholder base, full of people who aren't concerned about climate change. It's a really unfortunate and unintended second order effect of a screening approach. And so at our firm, engine number one, we really want to be known as active owners, but really driving this conversation as an economic issue.
Thank you for sharing that. Let's focus on public and private sectors in this conversation. So Ben, back to you. What innovative ways have you seen the public and private sectors are working together to address climate change? And are there other environmental concerns regarding risk sharing in this regard?
Yeah, I think we're just scratching the surface in the housing and mortgage markets in this space. I mean, I don't know if people fully appreciate just how nationalized the mortgage market is at the moment, but a huge fraction of all mortgage loans for households are going through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the FHA, and they can play a huge role in communicating information and in pricing this risk appropriately. I think on the information side, in terms of partnerships, there's been some interesting developments with the National Association of Realtors and thinking about their incentives to disclose the flood risks appropriately. And we're seeing firms like Redfin putting flood scores on their property listings. And so just like when you search for a property and you see, well, what's the walkability, what are the local schools like? Now you're seeing this flood factor score that's coming from the First Street Foundation, which is doing really the most innovative work on running these flood models. And so I think, there's a lot of potential there for collaborations between these government entities that are ultimately underwriting a lot of the loans that are being made, and then the ways in which sort of the private sector is disseminating the risk. I guess one other example is more thinking about the inside of buildings as opposed to the outside of buildings and thinking about their energy efficiency. And there's a program that's called the PACE program. It's the Property Assessed Clean Energy Program. And this is a green financing initiative that's largely for commercial real estate, but has some potential reach into residential real estate. And I had an amazing undergraduate student who I worked with this past summer, Jason Sho, so I'll give him a shout out. He taught me everything I know about this CPACE program. And it's really, has sort of untapped potential. And he really made the case for why building owners who might historically have had a very short sort of timeline in terms of, my investment horizon is only 5 or 10 years, and this, investing in a more energy efficient building isn't worth it. With these new financing vehicles, there's real potential to do this, and it's really being fostered by collaborations between especially state governments and the private sector. So I think that's something that's on the frontier of innovation in this space.
I hope Jason's parents are listening. They'll be smiling ear to ear with that shout out. David, investors are realizing that the responsibility for addressing climate change doesn't belong solely to the government. To what extent do companies need to fill in that gap? And is it possible to address the needs of shareholders while doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is absolutely possible to address the needs of shareholders while thinking about climate change. And I'll go back to the point I made just a few minutes ago that we really fundamentally believe that climate change is an economic issue. And if you think about it as an economic issue, it poses material risk to your business if you're sort of on the wrong side of this transformation. If you generate 100% of your revenue today from fossil fuels, you have to ask yourself, how durable is your business over the next 20 years? When thinking about climate change as an economic issue, companies actually have a fiduciary responsibility to address that risk on behalf of shareholders. So the way we think about companies today and the way we think about investment decisions is that companies really sit on the right side of transformation or the wrong side of transformation. And if you're on the wrong side, if you're one of the companies that is solely dependent on fossil fuels for revenue, think about the number of headwinds that stack up against you in the future over the next 5 to 10 years as the world moves towards net zero targets. You have government regulation, and that's going to continue and probably increase pressure on your business. You will see technological innovation coming from outside of your core business, trying to disintermediate or replace the sort of business that you're running. We expect that you will have difficulty recruiting and retaining employees. I would imagine that everybody at Wharton is not scrambling to go work for a fossil fuel company. We think that's going to continue. We think that customers are going to move away from these businesses, whether it's making decisions to buy electric vehicles or companies like General Motors who are committed to moving their entire fleet to EV by 2025. And so all these things stack up as pressures on your business, and the market sees that. They see it and they reflect it through first multiple compression. They start to discount those cash flows and the terminal value of that business and compress the multiple of that business. And over time, you will see earnings pressure into that business as well. Conversely, if you're on the right side of this sort of transformation, if you're taking the right steps, the market's going to reward you. They're going to see the tailwinds that are stacking in your favor, whether it's regulatory tailwinds, consumer preference changes, technological innovation that's occurring within your organization, or your ability to recruit and retain the world's best talent, all of course graduating from Wharton. So, this is this is where we kind of see the market responding to these risks and rewarding companies with valuations appropriate with their growth rates associated with how they're addressing the risk. But it's also an opportunity for companies. It's an opportunity for companies to create value by changing their behavior and their business to address some of these things for shareholders.
Thank you. It's just been interesting for me being in higher education for so long to see the shift. You talk about this from a talent perspective, and to really see what students who are coming in now versus 10 years ago, what their interests are and what kinds of companies they want to work for. And they're really walking with their feet in terms of making choices around their career journeys, and this matters to them. So Sarah, a challenge of many, we hear phrases like carbon neutrality and net zero and zero carbon. I'm going to ask you to sort of actually be a professor for a moment and give us a primer on what some of those things actually mean.
You have given me the greatest question because I love being a professor and explaining these things. So you're absolutely right. There are a lot of kind of catchy phrases and slogans out there, everything from net zero to carbon neutral to carbon negative. And the announcements, again, are kind of coming now on a daily basis. Major consumer products firm X is going to be net zero by 2050. The world's first shipment of carbon neutral oil apparently has been put onto a cargo ship, and a NASCAR racing team has claimed that it plans to be net zero by 2050. So this obviously leads to the question of how is it possible that these fossil fuel dependent entities could possibly achieve net zero emissions in our lifetime. So the idea of net zero is really an accounting metric, and the idea is that any entity puts out greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So over a certain period of time, to be net zero, it also has to remove an equal number or amount of greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere in order to achieve an equilibrium or a zero balance. So that's the basic idea of net zero. And carbon neutrality means the same thing. So carbon negative would be going one step further to remove more emissions than the entity puts into the atmosphere. And so anything from a firm to a nation to a university could make a pledge to become net zero by a certain date. So um, uh, the challenge comes from the fact that there's no generally agreed upon methodology for how an entity can legitimately achieve net zero emissions. Um, for example, an entity could achieve net zero emissions simply by zeroing out all of its emissions, right? To divest from all fossil fuel assets or something like that. But for most firms, there's some practicable way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's the gap, right? We're still emitting something. So how do we get to zero? And the way to get to zero is often by purchasing carbon offsets or carbon credits, for which there are global markets. And this is the idea that you purchase a unit, which is equal to the removal of 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. And this can be achieved by planting trees or other nature-based solutions. It can also be achieved through mechanical or natural carbon capture and storage. So, there are plants in Squamish, British Columbia, and in Iceland and elsewhere that are attempting, like large vacuum cleaners, to suck carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. But what becomes controversial is the question of how far an entity needs to go to reduce its emissions before it can purchase those offsets. So there are a number of different private standard setting organizations, among them the Science Based Targets Initiative or the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance, or other organizations that have ways of verifying that firms are actually meeting these commitments. But you asked also, what can governments do? I think the most important thing right now is actually to seek additional disclosure from firms about how they are meeting these targets, as well as more disclosure from firms about the emissions that they're putting out into the atmosphere, because that can increase transparency and accountability for some of these claims.
Well, thank you. And speaking of disclosures, David, investors are a significant voice in the call for increased climate risk disclosures from companies they invest in. What would investors like to see implemented, and what are the benefits of improved disclosures that firms or financial institutions might not fully understand yet?
Yeah, I mean, Sarah was really speaking to me when she talked about transparency. I mean, that's what we really want. Until we get sort of a universal agreement on how these things are going to be reported, the increased amount of transparency is really the first step for investors. And the reason that investors want transparency is because everybody benefits from transparency. The companies have the ability to sort of disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It allows investors to better underwrite the value of the business and the risk associated with the business. More importantly, I think, and this goes back to some comments I made earlier, it's an opportunity for companies to sort of have that transparency with investors. And then when they begin to reduce emissions, either through their operating decisions or the carbon markets that Sarah mentioned, investors can start to reward that company for better behavior, better decision making, sort of better long-term durability over time for that business. And investors should reward that business by giving them better valuations, whether it's through multiple expansion or sort of thinking about how they make capital allocation decisions around that business. And so we expect that with increased transparency, we should see an acceleration of better decision making and contemplation of these issues for investors as they make investment decisions in different companies. But again, an opportunity for companies to increase their value over time by being more transparent and then creating that trend of addressing emissions over time.
So, Sarah, I want to come back to you. On disclosures, a challenge of many of the voluntary climate risk disclosure programs, both globally and in the US, is their lack of standardization and the fact that they are non-binding. Is there any movement to remedy this? And if so, how will they address this problem?
Great question. There is a tremendous amount of activity in this space right now. So you're absolutely right that right now, at least in the United States, climate-related disclosures and ESG disclosures are frequently and largely being driven by voluntary platforms like the CDP or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and others. And so as a result, firms are making more robust disclosures in voluntary corporate sustainability reports or to these specific platforms than they are in their mandatory annual and quarterly disclosures to the Securities and Exchange Commission. But the Securities and Exchange Commission is actively working in this space. Going back to 2010, the SEC actually issued a guidance for firms as to how they ought to disclose climate-related risks in their annual and quarterly filings. But the record of enforcement was rather spotty, even at the beginning. Last month, the SEC started issuing enforcement letters to firms saying, essentially, we know that you are capable of doing better disclosures because we've read your voluntary corporate disclosure, sustainability disclosure reports. And so we expect you to do better in your mandatory filings. So I think that's really interesting. In addition, the SEC earlier this year requested comment and received tens of thousands of comments as to how it could improve its ESG and climate-related disclosures more broadly. And so we anticipate that the SEC will issue a proposed rule in the coming months. So there's definitely movement in this space. The key question is whether those disclosures will only require what is called financially material climate-related disclosures, or whether they will be broader to include more integrated reporting of climate and ESG-related risks, even if those risks don't rise to the level of financial materiality. So much action is happening on this front, and it's an active space.
Yeah, sounds like it. Ben, you spoke about this a little bit earlier, but I want to dive a little deeper with you. How have climate risk disclosures affected commercial real estate, and what other climate-related issues are impacting the industry?
Yeah, I mean, piggybacking on what Sarah just said, that the commercial real estate industry is very interested in what the SEC is ultimately going to decide to require. And again, there's sort of this internal versus external disclosures from the real estate standpoint. So on the external side, you're thinking about exposure to hurricanes, exposure to floods, and ultimately exposure to sea level rise. And then on the internal side, you're thinking about energy usage. And the estimates are there's big ranges out there, but a lot of people estimate, the UN has estimated that 40% of the world's energy is used by the real estate industry. And so thinking about the right metrics for energy efficiency has been a challenge. And I think standardizing metrics in a way that sort of recognizes the sort of differences between energy efficiency and energy intensity, that doesn't punish necessarily density. And that's what I'm sort of most worried about. So New York City passed a new local law on this, Local Law 97, and it's targeting carbon emissions for large buildings. And I think it's absolutely, its heart is in the right place in terms of giving people a bright guidance that says, here's where we expect you to get in terms of your emissions. But it doesn't really make the distinction between, the Empire State Building and a smaller building. And so, it does in certain ways, but not others. It doesn't get all the way there. And so I think one of the real challenges is just what are the right metrics that we can use in this space, and how do we avoid punishing density, right? We know that city living is far more energy efficient than driving out to the far-flung suburbs. And so we want to encourage dense living, but we also want to make sure that dense living is done in a way that's sort of more energy efficient. And I think that's one of the challenges that these guidelines are going to have. And so the disclosures are the first step. And I think finding some simple standardized metrics that can make apples to apples comparisons easy across properties. But then I think the next step is if we're actually going to have some enforcement that's going to try to hit specific targets, how do we design those targets in a way that actually don't disincentivize a more dense urban lifestyle?
Yeah, I'm very. I have firsthand experience with what you're describing. We are moving soon into a house in Center City, Philadelphia, so I will be living in a densely populated area, but the home we're moving into is 221 years old. So I don't know that it actually has the infrastructure and architectural developments to be considered effective to what you're describing at this moment, but baby steps. All right, so looking ahead, David, what are the top things investors can do to make sure that they are protected from climate change risk while also moving the needle on how companies operate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, as an investor, you have to first underwrite the type of risk that you have with respect to climate change, and depending on kind of where you sit in the investment spectrum, you can do it from a company by company perspective, which is what we're doing in Engine Number One. If you're an asset allocator, you have a big portfolio of investments. They're private equity investments, real estate investments, public market investments that all sort of have risk associated with climate change. So the answer is a little different depending on kind of where you sit in the capital allocation spectrum. But for us at Engine Number One, what we do is use an investment framework that we've called the total value framework, and we underwrite the profitability of a company. We look at how it generates its profits through operations and what the future profitability of that company looks like. And then we look at the footprint that it has on the environment, the damages it does to generate that profitability. We also look at its social footprint as well. Does it pay a living wage? Does it recruit a diverse workforce? And we add those things up to the degree we can quantify them in dollar terms to create a view on a business that we call its total value. So very different from a traditional investment decision-making process in the sense that you're really looking at non-traditional issues as economic issues. And you look at the value of the business, you take the profitability of that business plus or minus its damages, and look at the value of the business over time. And that's, for us, is the best way to understand the risk associated with that business over the next 5 to 10 years. And if you see a change in trend, if they are addressing those emissions, or they are addressing that environmental footprint, or they are improving the things that they're offering to society as a whole, then you can feel comfortable that the value of that investment is going to increase over time. If the trends go in the opposite way, then you have an issue, you have a risk, right? And you need to think about that as an investor and where you're going to allocate capital. And so that's our approach. We feel like it's the best way to really underwrite the material risk that is climate change.
Thanks for that. So for the audience's sake, we are coming to the last prepared question. So if you haven't had a chance to submit your question and would like to, please feel free to do so in the chat now. Ben and Sarah, I want to end with you. Based on your research, what should companies and regulators be prioritizing to address climate change in a way that will have lasting impact?
Well, you said my name first, so I'll go first, I guess.
Go for it.
I'm happy to, Sarah, unless you would rather go first. But I in terms of my research, I really come at this from a household financial decision-making framework, where a house is the biggest asset and the mortgage is the biggest liability for most households. And so, in terms of thinking about the risks that they face, these are really challenging risks for households to bear directly. And so they need support from the government, and they need support from the private sector, from insurance markets as well, thinking about the kinds of tail risks that we're talking about. And so, my hope is that there's going to be further development in both of those sort of public and private tracks. On the public side, seeing more focus on this from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, seeing more innovation in the flood insurance program that's going to find new ways to signal dynamic risk as opposed to annual renewals of insurance policies that don't really give people a sense of where prices are going to be in 5 years or 10 years. And then I think just on the private side, more innovation in insurance products that can protect households, and especially the most vulnerable households. And this is something that folks at the Wharton Risk Center are working on aggressively. They just got a new grant from the National Science Foundation to pursue some of these kinds of programs, and I'm excited to see what they come up with.
Great. Sarah, last word.
Great. Last word will be brief. My research focuses really on the ways in which public actors and private actors can work independently and together to address the climate crisis. And so I think the more that we see private actors taking up the mantle of working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not only from their operations, but from their value chains, I think that that's a real step forward. The two largest sources of emissions in the United States are transportation and electric power generation. And so those really need to be the two areas that public regulators ought to be focusing on to provide the right carrots and sticks to ensure a clean energy transition. And the final word, since we have the luxury of having David on this panel, is to talk about the ways in which both the public sector and the private sector can think about mobilizing public and private capital. Estimates are that we're going to need to triple our annual spending on renewables in order to support this transition to a net zero economy to the tune of about $4 trillion annually. Government spending goes a portion of the way, but we're really going to need a lot of private capital in that space. And so whatever we can do to direct the allocation of private capital in that direction, I think is a real important step forward.
Great, thank you. So we do have a number of questions that have come in from the audience, so I will share them. The first question, Ben, this is for you. Emmanuel asks, how can the field of finance, through modeling or otherwise, help companies make more optimal decisions?
That one's for me. Okay.
That.
I'd like to hear David's thoughts on that too. I mean, I think that there's, you know, in sort of in the housing and mortgage space, I mean, there's been a lot of improvements in analytics around risk assessment of climate risks in particular. And, you know, I think that there's been a democratization of this data as well, and that you've seen some nonprofits move into this space. And so for a long time, the data was really inaccessible to the average household or even the average investor. And you would have to pay huge sums of money to have access to one of these databases that would provide climate risks for your underlying portfolio. And so I think that that's a big step forward, and it allows individual homeowners to make smarter decisions, and it allows sort of small investors to make better decisions as well. So I see that as a big step forward.
David, is there anything you would add to that?
No, I think it was well said. I'll go back to our investment framework that we spent, a couple years developing, actually, with some Wharton professors. We have a white paper that we're happy to share with the audience afterwards that kind of details this. But the idea of quantifying in dollar terms data sets that were not available 5 or 10 years ago, that are material to the revenue generation, the cash flow generation of a business, is exactly what we need to do to make better investment decisions. We don't need to rank companies as good or bad. We need to understand in dollar terms what this means for their business and find the materiality and help them make those capital allocation decisions and investment decisions that'll benefit shareholders and stakeholders at the same time.
Great, thanks. Sarah, a question for you from Adolfo. He asks, do small and medium-sized companies face unique challenges related to managing their climate efforts? And do they have the resources necessary to meet regulatory requirements or address these issues?
So that's a really interesting question. I can't necessarily speak to the small and medium-sized company, but I can speak to the public-private divide, because obviously many of the companies that are making these net zero pledges and that are in the news are these major global corporations that are publicly traded. Those are the companies that are subject to the SEC disclosure rules. Those are the companies that are likely to be subject, even across the pond, to new regulations on sustainable financial disclosures coming from the EU, whereas small businesses are less likely to be subject to some of these public requirements. I think that the resource question is a really important one, and I want to build on something that Ben said, which is to say that for many years, I think it was quite expensive, and was really an individualized exercise for a firm to try to understand its carbon footprint, to try to understand its impact. And now there's so much publicly available data, and there are so many nonprofit organizations that are willing to work with firms on reducing emissions and improving the company's footprint, that I think that the costs are certainly reduced, even if it may be more burdensome overall for a smaller firm than a larger firm.
Thank you for that. All right, David, a question for you. Ethan asks, how do you ensure that the economic narrative about a company's financial impact does not overshadow the immediate needs of climate change?
Ooh, good question. I like it.
We have a
This
smart
is the
audience.
challenge. I know. I got to filter these. So look, this is the challenge, right? The economic narrative over the need to address the climate change issue. Our view is that we have to keep it as an economic narrative because that's what really gets these companies to pay attention and act with urgency. You've never seen companies move faster when you feel like their cash flow or their multiple in the market is under threat, right? And so by making it an economic conversation and not an ideological conversation, you really get the response that you're looking for and the urgency that we need to address these climate change issues. That's been a real sort of place that we sort of landed the fairway on in engine number one. We want to make sure that we're always making an economic argument because it just brings so many more people to the table and willing to listen when you can point to that materiality.
Great. So Sarah and Ben, a question for both of you. And you did notice I started with Sarah this time. So Natalie asks a question. I know our faculty will love, how do we ensure data availability and quality when it comes to creating regulation?
Well, I think actually universities have an important role to play, as do nonprofit organizations. I suspect that Ben may have been referring to some of the work by Climate Central, which is an organization that has published these incredibly detailed maps of sea level rise with very accurate projections. The work that many professors on the Wharton faculty do in applied economics and finance has been cited by federal regulators in adopting proposed and final regulations. To the extent possible, disclosure, right? We need to be very transparent about all of this information in standardized ways, right? That's why it's important not simply to rely on private voluntary disclosure rules, no matter how excellent they may be. If not everybody is following them, we lose the ability to performance benchmark, we lose the ability to benchmark over time. And so a robust set of disclosure requirements with public access to this data is really essential to ensure efficient capital allocation, to ensure excellent government regulation as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything Sarah just said. I couldn't do my job without big data sets. I'm a big data empiricist, looking at millions of deed records, mortgage applications, disaster loan applications, are just to name a few data sets I've been digging into recently. And so getting standardized metrics in this space is really essential on the research side. And I think the hope is that research can really inform policy and guide policymakers. And so, a big source for improving this is really coming from the government. And if the government, sets out, the SEC sets out a standardized set of reporting, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac can set out standardized reporting for the commercial real estate that they underwrite and support. The NFIP can ask for more standardized reporting from people in terms of adaptations that they're doing to their homes to make them more resilient and flood proof, and we can actually get some estimates of what's the cost benefit to raising your HVAC system off the ground a couple feet, those kind of things. And so I think at every level of this space we're often feeling around in the dark until we have this great data that can yield new insights, and so that's certainly what we're hoping for.
Thanks. All right, so this next question is for anyone. Great question from Henrique, who asks, will the current corporate focus on ESG risk mitigation eventually shift to a more impact-oriented framework, such as targeting UN Sustainable Development Goals?
Jump ball. I'll step in here, and because I felt like you guys have taken the lion's share of the questions have been great. I think that looking at the UN SDGs is an interesting and quite honestly a very impactful way to think about deploying capital. I think when you allocate capital, for impact and not just ESG, you really want to see material change, and the UN has set a really nice set of guideposts for us to think about ways we can drive that change. But I think in the beginning, you want to think about what outcomes are you looking for. And when we make capital allocation decisions and investment decisions in engine number one, we really think about very specific, very idiosyncratic outcomes, changes in behavior, changes in decision making, changes in business strategy that we want to see from companies that we invest in. That's how we define our impact. If we can get those outcomes, then we have achieved the impact that we were looking for. And so while we think about the UN goals and think about them in all of the investment conversations that we have, we really drill down to idiosyncratic outcomes to drive true impact from investing.
Terrific. Sarah, Ben, anything you want to add to that, or happy to move on to the next question if you don't? All right, I'll move on. So David, back to you. Eric asks, what federal policy would you most like to see adopted to enhance incentives for pro-climate investment strategies?
Oh, that's almost impossible for me to answer for a variety of reasons. I am not an expert in federal policy, nor do we think that that regulation is really going to help us accelerate the change from an investment standpoint. It doesn't mean that it's not going to change company behavior, and it isn't a necessary force for change in a lot of these issues. But it's not something that we're really dependent on because it's hard to predict. It can be very slow. And we want to act with a sense of urgency in a lot of these issues. We think that there's sort of two big forces for change out there: government regulation and capital allocation, or the capital markets. And our firm is focused on the thing that we can control, which is the capital markets. How do we drive the conversation in the investment community that's going to really reverberate through everybody's decision-making process and drive behavior change for companies? What the government's going to do is anybody's guess, and I would defer to the other people on the panel with me if they have thoughts. But it's very hard for us to call on specific action from a government to help drive some of these issues.
Yep. All right, so Sarah, this is a question for you. One of the major issues that arises when we think about private firms making unilateral climate commitments or marketing themselves as green is the concept of greenwashing. Can you explain what this is and how extensive is this problem? What do the data say?
Absolutely. So this is a really great and extremely important question. So I'm so glad that someone from the audience raised it. So greenwashing as a term refers to a collection or a set of deceptive marketing practices in which some entity, it could be a firm, it could be a government, essentially exaggerates the positive environmental attributes of a product or a service or of itself, the entity itself, in a way that's not necessarily supported by the evidence. So the challenge is that greenwashing isn't a legal term of art. One can't be sued for greenwashing, right? There are legal tools available to police deceptive and false claims in advertising, both at the federal level in the Federal Trade Commission and at the state level as part of state consumer protection laws. But because it's this very broad set of practices, everything from a firm claiming that its product contains 75% recycled material when that claim is demonstrably false and not supported by the evidence, to an advertisement in which a car appears next to Dr. Seuss's The Lorax, right? There's no factual claim there, but it's trying to create a positive impression about the product. And now we're moving into a space where there are a complaint has been filed with the Federal Trade Commission as to a firm's claim about its overall greenness, right? Emphasizing the positive steps it's taking toward the environment without having the disclaimer that it actually also is contributing a lot of emissions to the atmosphere. So this is a widespread issue, in part because there is some regulatory uncertainty. And one of the most interesting things that's happening in this space is that the European Union is taking steps to combat greenwashing with respect to sustainable finance and sustainable investments. And so just in the last year, the EU has adopted disclosure rules, again, harping on the disclosure point, to make sure that when a financial entity markets some investment as being green, that it actually has environmental benefit. And so disclosure is required. So this is a relatively widespread problem, but how big a problem it is depends very much on how broadly you're willing to define the term. So what's actually, the FTC is going to go after is a smaller aspect of a problem in which consumers are essentially being told that things are green when maybe the evidence doesn't bear it out.
I'm glad we got a chance to have you share that with us. This is an actual follow-up to that question, and David, it's earmarked for you. Greenwashing is also a topic of concern for investors. How can they best evaluate whether funds are truly making responsible investments? And what are the best ways for investors to engage with companies to ensure that firms are living up to their stated commitments to environmental goals?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Extraordinarily material to what's going on in the investment community right now. For our firm, I think we think about how what outcomes we want when we make an investment, and really, I think for investors that are deploying capital into an investment strategy. And they want to avoid greenwashing, I think they need to think about, what is their intent for making these investments? Like, why are they allocating capital to this investment manager? Is it to create awareness? Are they asking the investor to drive an outcome? I think that, for us, if we're going to put money to work in an investment strategy designed to address something like climate change, we need to judge the investment decisions in the sort of mission of the organization by the outcomes that it has. And those outcomes can be very idiosyncratic. And you want to be very, very careful not to make claims that aren't true with respect to your investment decisions. You want to point to the investment decisions you're making, point to why you're making those, and the outcomes or results of those decisions. I think that holding companies accountable, which is the second part of your question, is also really a material point when addressing greenwashing. And for us, we make investment decisions into organizations and then watch very carefully through active engagement, through active dialogue with those organizations on the decisions they're making inside of their business. What are they doing to address climate change? What are they doing to address other environmental concerns? And we want to make sure that those steps, that the steps that they're taking or they're telling us they're taking are actually happening on the timeline that they set forth. And so it's really about accountability and understanding the outcomes and intention before deploying capital.
Okay, thank you. So this next question is for the whole panel. Aditya asks an interesting question, and I'm going to start with Sarah and Ben. Should policies be focused on new investments in the right technologies or more on changing behaviors? And then David, a follow-on for you. Of the two, meaning invest in the right technologies or changing behaviors, what do you think is most effective for companies? So Sarah and Ben, let's start with you.
Ben, do you want to start?
Ben?
No? Okay, I'll jump in. I'll jump in while Ben is thinking. So I think it's a really interesting question because what your question is getting at is kind of where in the value chain is the fulcrum point for the greatest impact. And so you could map out any environmental problem, be it climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, or plastic use and waste, or cadmium in electronics. It could be anything, and you could come up with a way in which there's an upstream issue, an issue at the level of the manufacturer, an issue at the level of the retailer, an issue at the level of government regulation, an issue at the level of the consumer and how it disposes of or emits some kind of externality into the environment. And so for each environmental problem, there may be a different fulcrum point within the value chain as to where the pressure is going to be most effective. There's no question that the transition to a net zero economy by 2050 is going to require vast behavioral changes by individual consumers, right? Unless the government outlaws internal combustion engine vehicles, a whole lot of consumers are going to need to choose to purchase battery electric vehicles. Same thing for renewable power, et cetera. But the question of whether it's more efficient to focus on individual behavior change as compared to focus, which is, trying to address 300 million people or plus, as compared to 50 companies working in the space. My hunch is that focusing on the companies is likely to have more of an impact, but that the behavior change has to flow along with it.
I'll just jump in. The wonderful thing about being at Wharton is that we have faculty who explore both the large systemic issues and the behavior change. So I think you're right. Both ultimately matter. It's not really an either or question. Ben, I interrupted you.
No, I agree completely, and I think that our colleagues at Wharton have shown that behavior change is really hard. So I think one of the main takeaways from that research is that it's very difficult to create new habits and to stick with them. And a lot of behavior change, when the incentives expire, people revert back to their old ways pretty quickly, especially in this space of energy usage. The research on this has not looked especially great for sort of long-term change. And so, I think this is an area where we absolutely have to do both. But given the durability of these investments, especially of the built environment, I think the more that we can do to encourage innovation in that space, you've got a 221-year-old house, and so if we can find ways to build that house more energy efficiently and use more efficient materials, and find ways, building materials, energy use, all the things that make that a more efficient structure, that can have really persistent long-term benefits.
Yeah. So David, the last part of this question is for you, and this for our audience is our last question. Of the two, again, technologies and investment choices at the company level or behavior change at the individual level, what do you think is most effective for companies?
I'll start with the individual behavior change. I think that you're right. It's very difficult to get people to change their behavior, certainly, but don't give up. All those individuals out there that have changed their behavior and are making harder decisions, don't quit, because the companies are paying attention. They're doing things that are going to respond to the consumer, right? And we ultimately, all of us as individuals are consumers, and we have the best way to influence company decisions by where we spend capital and behavior decisions that we make. So keep going. But I think change at scale can happen at the company level, probably a little easier. Now they're paying attention to the consumers, but they can also make it easier on the consumers, right? If you go back and take a look at GM and the cars that they're going to offer as battery electric vehicles, to use your example, I think some of the trucks that they're going to put on the line in the next 2 or 3 years are going to be better vehicles. They're going to be better cars. And so it's going to be an easier decision for people when they go into the dealership and look at the combustion engine, they look at the battery electric vehicle, and they look at the torque on the battery electric vehicle, and they get excited about that, and they make the good decision, the environmentally positive decision, but also the easier decision to buy a better vehicle. And so the companies can continue to innovate, provide easier choices for us as we think about behavior change, and really drive those outcomes in concert with consumers making better decisions and sometimes tougher decisions.
All right. Sarah, Ben, and David, thank you. We learned a lot from your insights and perspective, and really thrilled that you spent your evening with us. Our next Beyond Business series will be Redefining Corporate Governance and will take place on November 16th with the following guests: Brian Stafford, Chief Executive Officer of the Diligent Corporation; Mary Hunter McDonnell, Associate Professor of Management at the Wharton School, and Luke Taylor, also an Associate Professor of Finance at the Wharton School. So please join us then, and until then, have a wonderful evening.